So thanks everyone for joining us this morning for part 4 of this series that we've been doing about talking about safe kids and healthy families. If you haven't seen the other 3 presentations, they are available recorded on YouTube as well. And the series doesn't necessarily have to be watched in order, but a lot of the concepts kind of build on each other. So it might be helpful to have the background of the other presentations if you haven't seen them yet. And today we're going to be talking to kids about online safety. So thinking about some different considerations of, problematic things that can come up with kids and online access, and then thinking about some kind of safety strategies to mitigate those things. And before we start, I want to acknowledge that I'm presenting to you today from the unceded territory of the Tecumseh people. I've been a guest on this land for just over 11 years, and I'm very grateful to be able to call this place my home. I'm continually supported and awed by the land here, and it makes me incredibly grateful to the people who've been taking care of this place from the beginning. And I hope to live up to being a good guest for all the time I'm here. A little bit about us. So I'm Jen. I'm the Community Partnerships and Public Education Coordinator at KSACC. And we're also joined today by Heidi, who's one of our counselors. She works with both kids and adults and families, so supporting people who have experienced sexual abuse or sexual assault or domestic violence. And so she's going to be with us, as I mentioned before, at the end of the presentation to facilitate a Q&A and to just be here for support as well for folks. And as I said, we both work at the Kamloops Sexual Assault Counseling Center, and we provide services for people who've experienced sexualized violence. And when we say sexualized violence, we're talking about all kinds of violence that are related to a person's gender or gender expression and are used to control or humiliate a person. And so when we say sexualized violence, we also mean things like harassment, stalking, domestic violence, abuse, and all of those assorted sort of gender-based violence aspects. And so we do community-based victim services, so helping people navigate the legal system, and then counseling programs for kids and adults, both group and one-on-one counseling. We also have crisis response, including our anti-violence crisis line that's 24/7, and hospital accompaniment as well for people who have experienced assault and need medical care. And then we also do community partnerships and education and outreach, so stuff like what we're doing here today. A couple little housekeeping pieces. We just ask that you keep your microphone muted until the end of the presentation, just so that we can mitigate any background noise. And then, as I said, too, keeping your camera off if you don't want to be in the recording. Then we'll have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. So if you have questions that come up during the presentation, if you just need something clarified, for example, you can feel free to type it in the chat, or just unmute yourself if you want to stop me real quick and just ask something to clarify, or you can just keep questions to the end. And then we'll also ask that during the Q&A to just be mindful of confidentiality. So just not mentioning any kids especially, or families by name, or any identifying factors. The Q&A won't be recorded, so we'll have a little bit more room to potentially have a conversation that might feel a little bit safer than having something that's recorded, but still just, of course, being mindful of confidentiality at all times. So today we're going to be talking about some of the positive uses of technology. I think it's really nice to kind of start with that framing, because we can often jump to being worried about what kids are doing online, or just sort of focusing on the negative aspects. But of course, the internet and online use is such a huge part of everybody's lives that it's important, I think, also to frame a lot of those positives, especially during COVID when we're all really separate. It's a way for people to keep in touch. And I think that there's so much good that actually is inherent in that as well. And then we are going to talk about some of the issues to be aware of. So things that could potentially be problematic, and things to watch out for. And then we'll talk about specific issues and those harm reduction or safety approaches, as I'd mentioned. And so some of those will be sort of broad, and some of them might be more specific to some of the issues we talk about. And then lastly, we'll talk about online safety in general and some resources that are available for people if issues come up. I always like to start these presentations by offering our anti-violence crisis line. So as I said, this is our crisis support service that we offer 24/7 out of KSACC. And so just to know that this is a resource for people, again, we're going to be talking about some things today that could potentially be triggering for people or bring up some feelings of unease or discomfort. And to also just normalize the fact that that's completely okay, that we're talking about heavy things. And of course, we're talking about the safety and the sort of potential risks that face kids that are in our lives. And so it's completely normal for that to feel a little bit overwhelming or a little bit upsetting. And so just to think about potentially having some self-care plans for after you watch this. So that might be planning to get out for a walk or talking to a friend, or if you realize that this really did bring up some big feelings for you and potentially something that you want to take steps towards working on for yourself, this crisis line could be a great place to start. Or maybe you have other places that you can reach out to, but just keeping it in mind that that might be a good thing to have in place for yourself. I wanted to start by just briefly mentioning the White Hatter, because this is something that I'm probably going to reference quite a bit during the presentation. This is a great resource for people who are having any kind of issues with kids and online safety and online risk management and harm reduction. And so the thing with the White Hatter is they are an organization out of Victoria, and they are focused on social media safety and digital literacy. And what I really like about the way that they work is that they do really focus on a lot of the positive aspects. And so like understanding that being digitally literate and having a good sense of how to use and navigate online spaces safely is really good for kids, because this is just the world that we live in. And so as they say in this quote in the corner, that risks and opportunities go hand in hand. And the goal is to show youth how to manage those risks based upon facts and not fear, and how to positively leverage the opportunities. This is what we strive to accomplish in all of our programs. And so I like that focus, that it's not necessarily the internet or using apps or anything like that that's harmful, is the way that kids are using them. And so we can teach kids to use them in a better, safer way, and we can learn that for ourselves as well. And so these guys have a big social media presence, so you can check out some of their stuff. And they also do school programs on all of these different, like a lot of the issues that we're going to be talking about today: internet safety, sexting, distribution of nudes, things like that. They also have programs to help people if they've had intimate images shared online and want to get those taken down. They actually provide that service for people. And they have a free ebook that's pretty great if you want to learn more about some of these things, called Parenting in an Online World. And it really covers a lot of topics. And I think that it does a really good job of taking some of the fear out of it. So what are youth doing online? I wanted to just kind of look at a few different aspects, because I think that it also sort of shows us how broad this is. So of course, like entertainment is probably one of the first things that we think about. I don't know that many young people who actually watch TV anymore, right? Like it's all doing streaming, watching YouTube and TikTok and those different kinds of things. And of course, gaming as well. And then getting information, whether it's, using Google or Wikipedia for school, or just to learn about things that they're interested in. Creating online spaces for themselves. And so sometimes kids are going to be joining and creating online spaces and interacting with other people who they meet online. And sometimes they're going to be in online spaces with the friends that they have in real life, but just have another way to connect with them. And again, like I was saying before, especially during COVID, and now things are getting a little bit more in person again, but it's so important for youth to connect with their peers. And so socializing online has been a really good way for folks to do that while they've been unable to do a lot of the social things that they used to do. Obviously, kids are back in school now, but even some of the sports and things like that that they still don't have, at least they've had that outlet to be able to connect. And then some kids are making money online, or at least trying to, whether it's by monetizing YouTube channels, or now even like there was a new chapter in that ebook from White Hatter about talking to kids about trading NFTs, which, like, we're not going to go into that because that is not something I have a lot of info on. But, you know, I think that I've definitely known kids who like are really have their hearts set on being YouTube influencers and making money that way, which is, you know, it's maybe not a hugely likely career goal, but it is, you know, they're going to be learning things about the process while they're trying to do that. So, you know, again, if they're doing that safely and in a way that isn't sort of self-objectifying, that can be a way for them to learn a lot of digital literacy. So again, looking at these positive uses. So kids can be pursuing passion and finding community online. And a lot of times, especially if they live in a smaller place and have really specific interests that they're not finding in their everyday life, then the internet is a really good way for them to connect with other people who share their interests or even their identities. Like sometimes, you know, for kids who grow up queer or trans, that they might not know anyone in their real life social circles who share those identities, and the internet can be a really safe way to kind of get more information and find community. They can be using the internet to gain knowledge on topics that they enjoy. So whether that's like learning new skills from YouTube videos or just going down rabbit holes, learning about, you know, the history of whatever kind of thing that they're really into at that moment. Again, like exploring identity, self-expression, and belonging. So I think that this is really important for kids who are growing up in places where they're not seeing themselves reflected, that they can go online and find community. Playing games and getting involved in esports. I know that a lot of people who don't game have a hard time framing gaming as a positive use, but I think that there's a lot that kids can learn from playing video games. Like it teaches you a lot about problem solving and teamwork, and even sometimes like critical thinking skills. And so again, it's more about how much and how often and the kind of games that they're playing, making sure that they're age appropriate, because you know, there are games out there that have kind of really mature themes that wouldn't be appropriate for all kids. But gaming really can be a positive and rewarding activity for kids to be involved in. Learning how to write code and doing other kind of tech stuff that might be something that they can turn into a career later on in life. Keeping in touch with friends, of course, like we talked about before, kind of having that ability to socialize when other options might not be available, or even like if kids move around a lot, that they can stay in touch with friends from their old school or town they used to live in easier than they could before. They might be making media, making videos or making music. And so again, this is teaching them a lot of skills, both on the tech side of things and also creatively. And then learning new skills, like there's so many tutorials, whether it's dancing or cooking or building things that kids can be learning how to do that they wouldn't have had access to a teacher for those kinds of things without the internet. And then they can be getting involved in positive social change. So like, you know, joining groups that are focused on environmental activism or different things like that. And that can also go the other way, of course, like they can also be getting involved in groups, or again, thinking about identity and belonging. That can also really have a negative side if we think about, you know, kids joining sort of more like hate groups and things like that. So again, a reason why we want to know what kids are doing online, but thinking more about the implications of what they're doing, how much time they're doing it, rather than just saying like limiting time online will be the answer to better use, because it really has so much more to do with the spaces that they're in and what they're doing. And so that's why we'll talk about in sort of the safety strategies, that having open lines of communication. And of course, if you have been to the previous 3 workshops, you'll know that this is sort of a common theme. It's creating those open lines of communication so that you know what's going on in your kids' lives. That's going to be the thing that helps you assess whether their internet use is a net positive or a net negative in their lives. So then coming to thinking about some of the possible negative aspects. And so you'll see a few of these have stars. And so these are the ones that we're going to dig into a little bit more. But just to kind of, put some of the things that we sort of think about when we think about problematic internet use. So sleep deprivation, of course, if kids are using technology late into the night, which is a good reason not to have any tech in the bedroom. Porn and hypersexuality, which we'll talk about more. Problematic use or like overuse, or what some people might think about as like internet addiction. Bullying and harassment that can come from always being accessible online. If we think about times before the internet, if obviously there's always been bullying and harassment, but most kids, that was often just happening at school or in different places. But when you came home, it kind of left you at the door. Whereas now with online spaces that can follow kids, and that is obviously a huge problem. We're not going to get big into bullying because I know that, kids get a lot of that at school, but just to recognize that, of course, that is a problem. Luring and catfishing. So this idea of exploitation of kids that can happen online. And again, we're going to go more into that one. Hate groups, racism, and misinformation, as we kind of touched on. And so again, the importance of knowing the spaces that your kids are hanging out in and what they're doing, what they're being exposed to. Body image issues and body shaming. So the comparison that can happen on social media and how that can lead to body dysmorphia and, feeling like you don't measure up. Selfies in dangerous situations. I feel like a few years ago, we were really hearing about this all the time, like people falling off of cliffs because they were trying to take selfies, or like, just really tragic situations that people were getting into for some pretty absurd reasons. And so, but this is the thing, especially with young people, they don't have that critical thinking skills developed yet. So kind of helping foster that. And again, the next one sort of goes with that too, these dangerous online challenges that kids do, like eating Tide Pods, which I just can't even, but that's how kids' brains work. And I know that there's a lot of other sort of this mythology around these other sort of online challenges, like the Momo challenge and stuff that was a few years ago. And a lot of those are actually more like urban myths and aren't really these sort of like self-harm cults that people sort of thought they were. Not that those things don't exist, but again, because those things can kind of pop up and swirl around from time to time, it's good as adults and caregivers to be aware of whether those things are misinformation or whether they are harmful, and to be talking to kids about that stuff. And then there can be issues for reputation and legal consequences. So that can be like things like cheating on exams, or how your online actions and your online presence can follow you and have implications for academic and employment opportunities in the future, which for kids, sometimes it's hard to think that far ahead when you just want to, like, post party pictures on your Facebook. But at the very least, it's a good reason to have your settings turned to private, but also probably a reason to think before you post. And then sharing nudes without consent. And we're going to talk about this one a bit today, and we're going to talk about it even more in the next session, where we're going to be talking about sex and sexuality and kind of some of the issues online that come with that. So we're going to dig into now some of these aspects just a little bit deeper. The first being talking about porn and hypersexuality. And so again, going back to the white header, they define hypersexuality as where young people are depicted or treated as sexual objects through media or marketing products that encourage them to act in adult sexual ways. And the thing about that is, like, the last point in this is that sex is really everywhere. And we're all, like, the majority of us are really bad at talking about it. And so kids are often getting exposed to, if not, full on porn, then like a lot of very hypersexualized content with no context for it. And of course, like, I think that we are all aware of how incredibly accessible porn is on the internet, and it's anonymous and free. It's not like, back in the days when you had to sort of try to sneak a look at a nudie magazine or something like that. Like, kids just have access to this stuff all the time, and some of them are looking at it intentionally, some of them are finding it by accident or being shown it like long before they're ready to process that, and some kids are looking at it because they're curious and they're not getting good sex education. And you can access porn in all kinds of different ways. Like, there's cartoon porn, you can just Google it, find stuff on YouTube. Even Netflix has some stuff that's really graphic and really inappropriate for kids. And the problem is, like, porn is a terrible replacement for sex education. So if kids aren't getting education in other places and they're looking at porn, they're not learning anything about sex. Like, they're learning about anatomy, but they're certainly not learning about communication and consent and pleasure even. And so I think that this is such an important reason the kids are getting really good and inclusive sex education, because they're not learning anything about good, healthy relationships if they're watching porn and not getting education. Because of course the thing is, it's going to be tricky to ensure that kids are never seeing porn or being exposed to really sexual images. And so sometimes the best approach is to at least give them a bit of a balance. And so some of the strategies around this is like acknowledging that there can be a lot of discomfort and embarrassment talking about these things, especially if it's a situation where it's a younger kid and maybe they've seen something that they weren't ready to see and they want to talk to you about it or process that. And that can be really difficult, and like understanding even in ourselves that we might feel very uncomfortable talking about those things, but being able to talk about them is so important to sort of unpack some of the problematic things that kids might be seeing. As we had talked about, keeping those lines of communication open so that kids can talk to you about things that they've seen if they're confused about what it means or just feel weird about it. And then talking about healthy relationships and consent and respect for partners and all of those things that we had talked about a lot in the last session. The last two sessions really talking about consent and boundaries, and then talking about healthy relationships so that kids understand that in sexual relationships, if done right, it looks a lot different than what they see in porn, where it's just like straight to the point, that there has to be so much communication before you're entering into a sexual relationship with someone. And then connecting yourself with resources as well so that you can improve your ability to have these conversations, because most of us didn't necessarily grow up having good and open conversations about sex and sexuality. And so you might need to really kind of bolster your own ability to have those conversations, and not thinking about talking about sex or any of this as like the talk, as we used to sort of think about sitting kids down and like birds and bees type of situation. But this isn't like a one-off. This is an ongoing conversation that can start fairly young. And again, we're going to talk a lot more about this in the next section when we talk about sex and healthy sexuality and how to talk about those kind of difficult subjects with youth. And then next, I wanted to talk about problematic use or addiction. And so I think that this has been a big fear of a lot of people, that the internet is this really addictive thing, and social media in particular, and that kids are like getting addicted to the internet. And so there is definitely problematic use and overuse that can get in the way of people functioning. And so, I think like any addiction, if you're using something to cope and it's to the point where it's interfering with other aspects of your life, then yeah, that's definitely a problem. But the research is sort of showing that like internet addiction or social media addiction isn't really as big of a problem as people are sometimes worried it is, and might not necessarily fit the classification of addiction. But again, like there is also research showing that it is more like an addiction. Anyways, it's not, the semantics of it don't really matter as much as, again, kind of understanding why kids might be spending hours and hours on the internet instead of doing anything else. And so we can see a correlation in the research too between excessive internet use and anxiety and depression, but it's not always clear whether being on the internet more is causing more anxiety and depression in kids, or if kids who already have a lot of those issues are going to the internet as a place to cope, because maybe that's where they feel safe, or maybe that's where they feel seen. And so again, it's really about understanding what else is going on in that child's life and what they're doing online rather than how much time they're spending. And so the White Hatter actually lays out kind of their suggested usage and how to split that up to what can make for a relatively balanced and healthy amount of use. So they say sort of creative and educational use, about 3-ish hours a day. And so that might be like learning how to code, building websites, or making videos, and then even watching educational stuff, whether it's like how-to videos or even like documentaries where they're learning stuff. And then a couple of hours of social use. And so that might be like getting on social media or messaging with friends, or playing games online with friends. And so, a little bit less of that time, a little bit more of the educational or creative time. And then also building in some physical and active use, which, ideally about an hour a day. And so physical and active use, that might be things like geocaching or playing Pokemon Go, where like you're outside and you're moving around in your neighborhood, or maybe it's just like physical activity that isn't related to technology, but trying to build in like at least an hour of physical activity, even if it's just walking or being active, to kind of balance out those other hours that kids are spending online. And really, like, if you look at this, like that looks like a lot. That's like 6 hours a day. And so like I was saying, I think this is the thing about the White Hatter. It's like they're not suggesting that we limit kids' use really severely or anything like that, but just like are mindful about what they're doing and kind of monitoring how they're using it. And you don't have to let kids use the internet for 6 hours a day, but just to say that, sometimes it can be very restrictive, and then they don't have time to do the things that they might need to do, whether it's for school or just for building up their own hobbies and interests. So then the next thing that I wanted to talk about was this idea of like luring and exploitation that there can be a lot of fear around. So again, this is not as common as people fear, where people are getting sort of like when we talk about luring, it's this idea that a stranger online is grooming a child and then kind of taking them away from their home and like trafficking them or things like that. And so it's not particularly common, but of course it does happen, and some kids are more at risk. And so it's kind of those vulnerabilities that we often see where kids who are who aren't living in a family home, so whether they've run away or in care, 2S and LGBTQIA plus kids can be more at risk, especially if they have been rejected by their family, youth living in poverty and those kinds of things. So again, like it's not to say that this doesn't happen and we don't need to be aware of it, but it's also not this huge rampant issue that needs to be sort of front of mind when we're thinking about kids getting online. And just like with any other kind of abuse and exploitation of kids, unfortunately, usually the perpetrators are known to the child and the family. And so this is this whole idea that we still sometimes think about stranger danger and teaching kids how to protect themselves from strangers, but we need to actually be teaching them kind of more of a situational awareness and like trusting themselves and how to sort of assess whether a person is safe or not. Catfishing, which people might have heard of, is just basically anytime that someone creates a fake online persona and uses that to scam someone. And so what this can look like sometimes is like, it could be an adult pretending to be a younger person to get to know a kid, whatever the intention is. And a lot of times the intention is not to actually physically exploit them or like get them into sex work or anything like that, but just to blackmail them for money. And so sometimes that could look like, you know, getting the youth's trust and then getting them to send naked pictures and then telling them that they're going to share them with their friends and family if they don't send more or send money. And when I was reading about this too, one aspect that I never thought about is that this can happen to boys too. And often they'll be catfished by someone who's pretending to be a young woman and, you know, wants to get them, get close to them and then suggest that they maybe like get their cameras on and like get naked together, and then we'll screenshot that and then blackmail the boy. And so again, not to like frighten anyone into thinking that this is really common, but just to know that we sometimes worry more about girls and to know that our boys can be at risk as well. And so thinking about safety for this aspect, again, it's that idea of like situational awareness. If a person sort of pops up in your social media or somewhere else, like getting them to think about who is this person and why are they getting in contact with you or suddenly really interested in you. And it's hard because a lot of times people know what they're doing. And so they want to make kids feel really special or feel like, you know, don't tell anyone about this because they want to understand like kind of those very classic grooming tactics. And so again, like we've said many times before, just keeping those communication lines open so that you know what's going on, monitoring, sort of similar to when we talked about unhealthy relationships, like kind of monitoring the behavior if you're seeing big changes, talking to kids about are there new people in your lives, and you know, what kind of things are they talking about? Are they trying to get you to do things you don't feel comfortable with, that kind of thing? Do they seem too good to be true? Which of course is often how those situations start off. And then if something does happen, trying not to panic. So like if you find out that a kid had a nude photo that they shared and it got leaked, or now they're being blackmailed with it, you know, it's probably pretty tempting to get quite in a panic about that. And it is, you know, a worrying situation, but there are resources you can connect to, like the White Hatter, and there's another one called cybertip.ca, and we'll talk about those at the end, that you can connect with that can help you with those situations. And a lot of times these situations can be dealt with effectively if you know where to go. So again, if something happens, you want to be stopping contact with the person who is making threats. Or, you know, threatening to blackmail or asking for pictures or whatever. And then you want to kind of take screenshots and collect evidence of anything that happened so that you have, if it becomes a situation where it's bad enough that you need to report it to the police, that you've got a bit of a paper trail. And again, like this might be something that you never have to deal with, but just, I think that it's kind of nice to know that if something like this happened, you would have some sense of what to do. So collecting the evidence, cutting off contact, and then getting in touch with the police or the White Hatter. And especially if it's a youth, if the person is asking them for naked pictures, like that's something that's reportable to the police. And then especially if they're exploiting or blackmailing at all, then that is absolutely something that should be reported either to the police or to an online resource that can help you with that sort of thing. And then I think that we can really think about how body image can be shaped by what kids are seeing online. And I think that this is really true for girls especially, but also for boys. And I think that I've just been noticing this trend in media where like the standard for bodies for men and boys has really gotten quite absurd. Like everyone's meant to have these huge muscles and like, be really fit all the time, which is just as unachievable as I think the standards have been for girls for a really long time, to be really thin and have like just the right proportions depending on the decade and all of that stuff. And social media can really make that worse because people are sort of putting their best image forward, and then of course advertising and like all of the things that we see where people are really sort of super idealized bodies that are photoshopped and not even real. It's like the person in that picture doesn't even look like that, let alone anybody in real life. And these are all based on these sort of cultural body standards which change from time to time. And so it's not even like there's this perfect ideal body, because now it's like, it used to be just being really thin, and now it's like being thin but having a big butt, and like just it's completely unattainable and also an ever-moving target. And so it's more important that we're teaching kids just to be happy with how they are and how they look. And on top of sort of the cultural body standards, there's also these European beauty standards where kids who are racialized or, don't fit the mold of kind of this beautiful, like European looking person, don't necessarily see themselves reflected or see themselves as being beautiful or worthy. And that can have a lot of effect on kids' self-esteem and can lead to things like eating disorders or over-exercising or really unhealthy behaviors that can both help it feel like you're getting to a body that you might eventually like, which is often very false too, because of course with things like eating disorders, you never get there. Like it's always the next level that's going to make you happy, and that you sort of never get to that point. And also the thing with eating disorders or overexercise of those things, it's like also kind of gives this sense of control over something in your life. And so I think it's really important, especially with kids who've experienced different kinds of trauma or are living with a lot of stress, that we're really mindful of their behaviors and watching out and keeping them safe if they're starting to develop those behaviors, because it can be really tempting, I think, for kids and really so harmful for them. And so then some of the things to think about for mitigating some of those issues around body image and self-esteem are like following influencers who highlight different kinds of bodies and beauty standards. And so I wanted to make this slide. I think sometimes when we like talk about body image in these sort of settings, we'll like bring up a slide with all of the problematic advertising pictures of like beautiful people. But I thought, actually, let's instead bring up a bunch of people who are like super cool and breaking the mold. And so up top, doing this cool yoga pose is Jessamine Stanley. She identifies as like a fat, black, queer yogi, and she's amazing and really like, defying what beauty is, especially in an industry like yoga, which is often a lot of like thin, white, muscular people, kind of portraying this image of perfection and beauty. Sheena Novalinga is an Inuit TikTok influencer she's great, and she's got this huge big heart and like really proud of her culture, and she just got these beautiful face tattoos. I follow her on Instagram, and it was just really neat seeing her journey of like being really excited to do this thing. And she's a model, I think, as well, and so people had told her like, oh, you can't get face tattoos, but it was really important to her to connect with her culture in that way. Notorious Cree, I think his name is James Jones. He is a powwow dancer and also a break dancer. And so he's kind of doing this cool mix of like being a really cool urban person, but also again, like really connected to his Cree culture, and does a lot of videos about like celebrating culture and sort of talking a lot about like connecting with his roots. Then on the bottom, we've got Martinez Evans, whose handle on Instagram is 300 pounds and running. And he is a marathon runner who has a body that people might not necessarily think of as being like a marathon runner's body, and just really, again, kind of like breaking that mold or that bias that like a runner looks like a certain thing. Like, and the fact that he's on the front of Runner's World magazine, I think is great, because again, even sometimes like thinking about fitness, we're so focused on like, oh, fitness is going to give me this great body, that we don't think about like all of the other things that running or yoga or things like that can do that are separate. And like, so, you know, fostering a feeling of feeling really good in your body and like not having it necessarily relate to like, so you can look a certain way, I think is such an important message for kids. And then the last one, going clockwise, Snotty Nose Res Kids are a hip hop duo from the Haisla Nation. And they're also just great, like really creating great music, and also like just great rappers rapping about culture, and really like, I think a great thing for young people to look to that like represents them, and also is just like great music and really like making a place for themselves in the world. And so another thing in terms of sort of fostering self-esteem and helping to mitigate some of those body issue stuff is like pointing out the photoshopping and unrealistic standards that happen both in advertising, but also online, where people are really using filters and like doing all of this stuff where it's like, people don't even look like that. So there's no way that you can compare yourself to those images. I found a couple of YouTube videos, which we won't have time to watch today, but I would recommend checking them out and maybe watching them with kids. So one is a bunch of different women get photoshopped into different cultures' beauty standards, and then just sort of like look at that and talk about what that looks like and how the standard is different throughout culture. So again, it's like you can be really beautiful in one place and not fit the mold in another, which I think just points out how flawed it all is. It's not like it's, you know, a biological imperative to look a certain way, because we all have different ideas about what that is. And then the second one is just a short video about the effect that social media can have on body image. So those can help start conversations with kids. And then, as I was kind of mentioning, like talking to kids about exercise and eating habits that make them feel good, and not focusing so much on, if you do these things, you're going to look this way and then you'll be happy with yourself. It's like, how can we start with, if you exercise and eat well, you're going to feel good in your body. And then like what your body looks like is secondary to that. And so, because I think that these things go hand in hand so much that we sort of lose sight of why we want to feel good in our bodies, not necessarily to look good, but just to feel clear-headed and strong, and you know, stress reduction and all of those things, I think is so much more of an important aspect to focus on than trying to fit into a mold. And then thinking about some of the reputation and legal consequences of online life. So we know that employers and university recruiters, so like thinking about scholarships or things like that, are looking at social media to screen candidates. And so some of the common reasons that candidates are passed up are things like posting provocative pictures on their social media, talking about or posting videos about drinking or drug use or partying, talking badly about past employers, or also just poor communication skills. And so again, like we might think like, oh, it's not really fair for employers or recruiters to be looking at that and judging a person off of their social media, but we know that they do. And so at the very least, as I mentioned before, this is a good reason to keep your settings to private, so that people can't just find you and like see your whole history online, but also a good reason to just maybe not say things that are really you know, bad-mouthing your employers, or posting your pictures of you passed out at a party and those kinds of things. And like, I think that it is often hard for kids to think about the implications of those things rather than just doing them in the moment, but getting them to consider that, especially as they get closer to wanting to look for jobs and potentially go to university and things like that. And then the other big legal consequence issue that often comes up with kids in online life is the non-consensual sharing of intimate images, or like revenge porn or leaking nudes, or different ways that we can talk about it. And so the thing about kids taking or sharing nudes or sexts, so like, naked pictures or provocative pictures that they then send to someone, is that sometimes people are unaware of whether or not that constitutes child pornography. Like if a child under 16 or under 18 takes a picture of themselves, is that automatically child pornography? In Canada, it isn't. So there is like case law that states that kids can create intimate images of themselves if everyone in the image is consenting and there's no illegal activities depicted. And so by illegal activities, mostly it's thinking about the age of consent laws that we talked about, I think, in the last presentation or the one before. So where kids under 16 can be consenting to sex, 14 and 15 can be, but only with someone less than 5 years older. 12 and 13-year-olds can consent with someone less than 2 years older, under 12, not at all. And so all of that applies to the pictures, but youth are allowed to have pictures of themselves or their intimate partners that were given to them with consent without it being child pornography. So a lot of times this still gets used as a scare tactic for kids, that like, if you ever take a nude and share it with someone, like you're going to get charged with child pornography, which they're really not. And even so, the illegal part then comes if you share that picture with someone without their consent. So that is, again, not usually going to be charged as child pornography, but there is a law against non-consensual sharing of intimate images, which kind of reflects better what that is. Like it's a form of sexual violence, certainly. And so that is a consequence that kids could face for sharing nudes that they don't have that person's consent to share. And again, we are going to talk about this actually in a little bit more depth, even in the next session, but just wanted to kind of touch on all of that. And so again, just like so many other things that we've talked about, you want to make this conversation like a conversation that you're setting a foundation for long before it ever happens, if it happens. So if a kid in your life is having a sexual relationship with someone or an intimate relationship, and they've sent that person a photo, then later on that somehow gets leaked, not jumping into blaming the kid, like, how could you have done that? Like, it's so risky to send nudes, but more like treat them how you would treat someone who had experienced a violation, because that is what has happened. And whether or not you think that they should have sent the nude in the first place, the point is that they shared it with someone they thought they could trust, and it turned out that they couldn't, and that isn't their fault. And so I was hearing about some research that was done that was saying that an unsupportive or blaming friend or parent or caregiver was sometimes the worst part of having a nude shared for youth who'd had their photos leaked. And so being able to switch from that mindset of saying like, oh, well, you knew that could happen if you shared a nude, to like, I'm really sorry that happened to you. Because I think the thing too, it's like, sexting and sharing nudes is, I think, another sort of aspect of online life that we kind of need to shift our thinking about, especially with older youth, where like maybe they're in a sexual relationship or like an intimate relationship, but they're not ready to do things in person yet. And so maybe like sharing photos is a first step where then they feel like, okay, they want to, it's like fun and exciting for them, but they don't want to do anything physical. And so just like understanding that itself is a form of kind of harm reduction when it comes to sex and how youth might relate to each other in sexual situations. And so some of the strategies around that are more like harm reduction strategies. And so that might be, if kids are going to send nudes, like not having their face in the picture, or if they have any tattoos or piercings, to not have those like identifiable things in the picture, to not have a background that's like really obviously your room, or like, something with your name on it in the frame. And then also, I heard a suggestion that I thought was really great, like harm reduction for the person who receives the photo is like, after you've used it for its intended purpose, delete it. Because you might know right now, like you would never share that. This is a person you love and care about. But like, what if you break up and you're really mad one day and you think like, oh, just, your sort of undeveloped child brain thinks like, I'm going to get back at this person. And like, with poor impulse control, you send it to someone and maybe you're going to regret it hugely later, or you're drunk and someone talks you into it, because, kids sometimes, or youth, pressure each other into sharing photos that were never meant to be shared, or, these sort of pressures of proving your sexual prowess or whatever. So you can mitigate that by just deleting the photo, which is something that, again, we sort of focus more on the person sending the picture. And I think sometimes when we think about that, like we often think of a girl sending a picture to a boy and we're telling her how to keep herself safe, but not telling him how he might think about harm reduction as well. And of course, recognizing it could be the opposite and it could be a same gender situation as well. But just thinking about how we can be at a point where we can think about how kids can keep themselves safe, but also acknowledging the realities of their lives. All right, so that was a lot. So we're gonna just take a little moment, check in with yourself. That was kind of a lot of heavier stuff, or like things to be worried about. Maybe there were things in there that you hadn't been worried about, and now you are, which I hope is not the case. But yeah, just to acknowledge that feelings might come up. So feel free to take a breath and recognize that anything that you are feeling is totally normal and totally welcome. So now we're going to get into a little bit more about some of the safety stuff, and some of the more sort of general things that can help kids navigate their online world and develop digital literacy. So some stuff to think about for safety is like having parental supervision for when kids are using the internet. So that can look like having the computer in a central place in the home, or if kids have smartphones, not having them in their bedrooms with them at night. Like with kids having smartphones, it's going to be a little bit harder to monitor what they're doing. But there are ways that you can block sites. You can check their history. You can see what kind of apps they're downloading and what they're using. And then there are different programs like Family Sharing and Ask to Buy, which kind of give you a heads up about what your kid's doing online. And all of this stuff, there's actually a lot of good information about these strategies in that White Hatter ebook. And what they really suggest is like, if you're going to be monitoring, which they suggest that you do, like you do keep appraised of what your kids in your life are doing online, but you tell them. So you're not sneaking around checking their internet history, but you're giving them a heads up, like, I can check the internet history. And so I'm going to, from time to time, just to see what you're doing online and make sure that you're, especially with younger kids, like make sure that you're doing stuff that's safe and age appropriate. And then in that White Hatter book too, they talk about like building up to saying like, if you can show me that you're using this responsibly, you're not harassing people, you're not like looking at things you shouldn't be, you're not getting involved in things that aren't appropriate, then, you'll get a little bit more freedom, and then kind of doing it like that. So you're sort of like, it's like training wheels, right? Like you're supporting them and giving them enough responsibility that they get to make some choices. And then the next step is based on whether or not they've made good choices. And so it's teaching them kind of those critical thinking skills as well. Again and again, just thinking about communication and keeping the conversation going with your kids. So asking them what they do online, where do they spend time? Maybe even gaming with your kids, or getting them to teach you about gaming or different apps that they like. It can be a really fun way to get involved in something that's really important to them. And it can also like teach you something like, you might even be surprised that maybe they're doing stuff online that you're like, oh, this is actually really fun. Like maybe I'll start playing Pokemon Go with my kids, like, or whatever it is. Having opportunities for them to teach you, which I think like young people often like to feel like they have thoughts and ideas and skills that someone else is interested in. And then it also just helped you know what they're up to. And then there can also be software and hardware support options. So like I was saying, that like family sharing and ask to buy are things that you can install that can help you with monitoring what kids are doing. And there's lots of options and consideration about that in that ebook, or if you go to the Whiteheader website. And then Whiteheader also has these kind of like contracts for setting family technology boundaries. So like sitting down with kids and saying like, okay, here are your rights when you're online and here are your responsibilities. So like you have the right to do these amount of things, spend this much time, but you're responsible for not, you know, being bullying online, or not, you know, looking at adult content or things like that, and having that in a place where, and also saying like, and these are going to be the consequences if you do that, so that everybody's on the same page and that nothing comes as a surprise. It gives you a footing for saying like, this is what I'll do, so that you don't have to wait until something happens and then think like, what's the appropriate response to this? You've already talked it through and laid it out. And then kids also know what's expected of them and what will happen if they don't abide by the rules that have been set out. And then that can change, and that can be kind of like continually assessed and looked at for how is it still appropriate, what needs to change, if anything. A few more additional safety tips is having a password protected phone if kids have a phone, and not just share their password with their friends. Sometimes this can be a thing with kids where it's like, oh, prove you're my best friend by giving you your phone password. But really that's not such a hot idea. Especially, you know, sometimes youth relationships can be a little bit hot and cold. And so, yeah, it's just best to avoid any kind of incident by keeping the password private. Keeping accounts private and not public. So again, that can be for there can be lots of great benefits to keeping accounts private. Like we talked about, thinking about employers or different sort of job or educational prospects, from being just having an open door to your online life. But even just for strangers or people, you don't necessarily need everyone. The whole idea of social media is that stuff that you're sharing with your friends and not the whole world. It is online, and so having social media always is never going to be completely foolproof in terms of keeping it from the eyes of people who you might not want seeing. But keeping it private is at least the first step to mitigating that a little bit. For parents and caregivers, learning the lingo. So when kids are talking about stuff that they're doing online, like, do you know what memes are? Do you know what ghosting is, or Easter eggs in video games? So that you know what kids are talking about. Again, it sort of helps build relationship. So you're not the old person who doesn't know what's going on. But it also helps when they're talking about things that you don't have to think like, what the heck is that? You're on the same page. Being a good role model when it comes to online life. So this idea of sharenting, which is like oversharing as a parent. I read something where some parents will post like up to 500 pictures of a kid in their first few years of life. Obviously with babies, like you can't really ask their consent if they mind if you post their pictures online. But with older kids, I think it's always really appropriate to model that consent by asking them if they mind if you take their photo and if you mind if they put it online, and being thoughtful about what you are posting. And then things like not texting and driving, not taking your phone into your bedroom at night, which I know like that's tricky, and people use it as an alarm clock and all of those things, but it can be an opportunity to model, having some restraint around those things. And yeah, so no technology in the bedroom, and even ideally like no screen time an hour before bed, because of course we know like how important sleep is for kids. And so not having that like really intense, even just the light of the phones, like I think we've all heard about how it really helps to start, getting our bodies ready for sleep if we don't have that like intense blue light at the end of the day. That can be a tricky one too, but it might be something that, you know, as a family you can work towards. And if everybody's doing it, everyone's committed to no screens an hour before bed, that can be really helpful, instead of just saying like, okay, you can't have screens an hour before bed, but then like sitting there on your phone, which I mean, you're allowed to do also, but it might help follow through. And then those contracts that I had mentioned from the White Hatter, so you can download those all off of their website. So one for downloading apps, a one for keeping passwords. They have ideas about keeping passwords safe and how to do that. And then that family collective agreement is that sort of rights and responsibilities for online use. And then a few other resources I wanted to share. This is cybertip.ca. So they are a resource for reporting exploitation online, and they can help if people are in a situation where there's been a non-consensual distribution of images, or if someone is trying to exploit a youth online. So there's somewhere you can reach out to. They have a reporting form, and they will help you with next steps in that process for getting the pictures offline and potentially even bringing action against the person who shared them, if that's possible. NetSmartsKids.org is a really good website for digital literacy for younger kids. They've got like online games and little like cartoon vignettes that are sort of teaching aspects of digital literacy, and then even have discussion guides to go with the videos so that you can have a conversation with kids about, you know, thinking about critical thinking in terms of online life and things like that. So that's a pretty good resource for younger kids. Mediasmarts.ca has things for different ages. So there's like more really young specific focus, and then sort of for teens and older youth. They have games, and yeah, they have a whole bunch of different subjects. So like you can kind of go on there and look at like cyberbullying or exploitation, or I think that they have stuff around like body image stuff too. So yeah, lots of good resources on there for having conversations, or for if kids want to go on there and like read about things that they're dealing with and sort of access something in a way where they don't have to talk to a parent, because sometimes it's easier to just go online and read about things. And they also have a tip sheet about dealing with leaked nudes, if that's an issue. Webwise.ca is a good website for older youth and teens. It's primarily focused for girls, but it has a lot of stuff around like sexting and harm reduction, and also like online dating and some considerations around that. So that's actually quite a good one for older kids. And I think it was actually created in collaboration with youth in Toronto. So it's yeah, it's got a feel of not being too like old people trying to sound cool talking to teens about using the internet, which is, it's nice. Like it's got a good style to it, good feel. So that's going to bring us to the end of the presentation portion of today. So again, just recognizing that, you know, any kind of feelings that came up with that, just recognizing that that's all right, and thinking about what you might want to do to take care of yourself. For those who are watching live, we're going to stop the recording in a moment and then get into conversation if people have thoughts or questions or anything. For anyone who's watching on the replay, you know, just thinking about how you might take a moment right after this to process everything that we've talked about. And if you have more questions as well, my email address is here, and you can reach out if you have questions, or you can call KSACC if you want to chat about anything in more detail. Follow us on Instagram for other good content. And yeah, we will wrap up. So I'm going to stop the recording.